the ancient blueprint. The library was colder than the rest of the castle. Its high, vaulted ceiling trapping shadows in its upper reaches. Bookshelves lined the stone walls, their wooden frames warped with age. The air carried a faint scent of mildew, ink, and decaying leather, a heady aroma that Alex would have found comforting in any other place. But here, in Bran Castle, it felt oppressive. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books, most of which were covered in thick layers of dust. The titles were faded, some in Latin, others in Old Romanian. A few were bound in cracked, weathered leather, the kind of tomes that might crumble to ash if opened too hastily. Alex had spent hours poring over the collection, searching for anything that could shed light on the castle's mysteries. Most of the volumes contained dry accounts of feudal history, tax records, and the occasional religious text. But one book, wedged tightly into a far corner of the shelf, caught his attention. Its spine bore no title, only a faded sigil that resembled an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail. The hidden map. Alex pulled the book free with some difficulty, its brittle cover flaking at the edges. He carried it to a nearby table and carefully opened it. The pages were thick and uneven, filled with elaborate handwriting and sketches in ink that had faded to a rusty brown. The text was written in Latin, its tone more poetic than scholarly. One passage caught his eye. Within these walls lies not just the flesh of man, but the spirit of the unknown. Seek ye the hidden path, where the divine and the profane entwine. The cryptic phrase sent a chill down Alex's spine. He flipped through the pages, his fingers brushing over intricate diagrams of the castle, each labeled with Latin annotations. One particular sketch made him pause. It was a blueprint of the castle, more detailed than any he had seen before. The diagram was old, clearly drawn before the castle's modern renovations. A network of hidden passages and concealed rooms was marked throughout, many of which didn't appear on contemporary maps. One room, in particular, caught Alex's attention. It was located behind the chapel wall, its entrance marked with a sigil similar to the Ouroboros on the book's spine. There was no accompanying text, only a single phrase scrawled in the margin, Aperiator Tenebris. Open to the darkness, Alex murmured, translating the Latin aloud. His pulse quickened. The chapel was one of the castle's most well-preserved spaces, yet no one had mentioned a hidden room. He felt a surge of excitement. A secret this significant could provide invaluable insight into the castle's history and its connection to Vlad Tepes. Mihai's reaction. Alex wasted no time. Tucking the book under his arm, he left the library and made his way toward the main hall, where Mihai was tending to a dying fire in the large hearth. The old man's face was lined with concentration as he coaxed the flames to life, the flickering light casting shadows across his furrowed brow. "Mihai," Alex called, his voice echoing slightly. The groundskeeper turned, his pale eyes narrowing. "What is it now, scholar?" Alex placed the book on the table and opened it to the page with the blueprint. "Look at this. There's a hidden room behind the chapel wall. Do you know anything about it?" Mihai's expression darkened immediately. His gaze flickered to the page, then back to Alex. "Where did you find this?" "In the library," Alex replied. "Why? What's behind that wall?" Mihai's jaw tightened. "Nothing that concerns you." Alex bristled. "Don't do that. Don't act like I can't handle the truth. I've come here to uncover the secrets of this place. And this," he gestured to the map, "is clearly part of it. If you know something, tell me." The old man slammed the book shut with a sharp motion, the sound reverberating through the hall. "Some doors are locked for a reason, Duma. That room has been sealed for centuries. Leave it that way." "Why?" Alex demanded, his frustration boiling over. "What are you so afraid of?" Mihai leaned heavily on his cane, his pale eyes blazing with an intensity Alex hadn't seen before. "You don't understand. That room isn't hidden. It's imprisoned. What lies within was never meant to be found." Defying the warning. Mihai's warning only fueled Alex's determination. He waited until the old man retired to his quarters before gathering his flashlight, camera, and a notebook. The chapel was located on the east side of the castle, its modest stone interior a stark contrast to the grandiosity of the main hall. Alex entered quietly, the creak of the heavy door echoing in the stillness. The chapel was empty, lit only by the pale moonlight streaming through narrow stained glass windows. Shadows stretched across the pews, their shapes distorted by the uneven stone floor. The wall described in the blueprint stood behind the altar, its surface plain and unassuming. Alex ran his hand along the cold stone, searching for any indication of a hidden mechanism. The faint engraving of an Ouroboros was barely visible in the center of the wall, worn smooth by time. He pressed against the engraving, but nothing happened. Frustrated, he stepped back and studied the blueprint again. The Latin phrase, "Aperiator tenebris," lingered in his mind. The hidden mechanism. Alex whispered the words aloud, half expecting something dramatic to happen. When nothing did, he shook his head, feeling foolish. He examined the Ouroboros again, tracing its outline with his fingers. This time, he noticed faint grooves within the serpent's body, grooves that suggested it could rotate. He hesitated. Mihai's warning rang in his ears, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. Gritting his teeth, Alex turned the engraving clockwise. The mechanism groaned in protest, the sound of grinding stone reverberating through the chapel. A faint click echoed from within the wall, and a narrow seam appeared, splitting the stone. Slowly, the wall began to shift, revealing a hidden passage beyond. The passageway. Alex's flashlight beam pierced the darkness, illuminating a narrow stone corridor. The air was damp and musty, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded him of blood. The walls were lined with crude carvings, symbols he didn't recognize, but which seemed ancient and sinister. His heart pounded as he stepped inside, the weight of the stone door closing behind him muffling the sounds of the chapel. The corridor sloped downward, the uneven floor slick with moisture. As he moved deeper, Alex couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The beam of his flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to shift just beyond its reach. Reaching the hidden room, at the end of the passage, Alex found another door, this one smaller and made of wood, reinforced with iron bands. The carvings on the frame were more intricate, depicting scenes of torment and sacrifice. His hands trembled as he pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and circular, its walls lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, ancient tomes, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and rusted tools that looked disturbingly like instruments of torture. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal. On it rested a small, ornate box, its surface inlaid with gold and etched with more of the strange symbols. Alex approached cautiously, the box drawing him in like a magnet. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement in the shadows. He reached out and touched the box. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a low, guttural sound filled the room, like the groan of a waking beast. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. A sudden presence. Alex turned, his flashlight darting across the room. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, gaunt shape with glowing red eyes. But when he blinked, it was gone. His breathing quickened as he turned back to the box. Something about it felt wrong, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He hesitated, then opened his notebook and began sketching the symbols on the box, determined to document his discovery before touching it again. But the moment his pen touched the paper, the groaning sound returned, louder this time. And then the door slammed shut. The discovery. Alex stood frozen in the small, circular chamber, the oppressive silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The air was damp and cold, with a faint metallic tang that he couldn't ignore. His flashlight beam darted around the room, revealing walls covered in intricate carvings. The markings were strange and disjointed, spiraling symbols, jagged lines, and grotesque figures twisted into forms that seemed almost alive in the flickering light. At the center of the room stood the pedestal with the ornate box he had noticed earlier. But now, with the door slammed shut behind him, Alex's sense of foreboding had grown. The box seemed more than a simple artifact. It felt like the focal point of the room, its presence commanding attention. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. The room held answers. He was sure of it, but it also felt like it held something else, something waiting. The artifacts. Alex turned his attention to the shelves that lined the walls. The wooden planks were warped with age, sagging under the weight of ancient artifacts. Jars filled with murky liquids and unidentifiable objects glinted in the flashlight's beam. Some of the contents looked organic, perhaps organs or remains preserved in viscous fluid. Others were crystalline, their jagged forms shimmering faintly as if they contained their own light. Among the jars sat rusted tools, blades, hooks, and tongs, arranged with unsettling precision. They were not implements of craftsmanship, but instruments of pain. The sight sent a shiver through Alex, and he forced himself to look away, his stomach churning. On one of the lower shelves, he spotted a pile of leather-bound tomes. He crouched down, carefully pulling one free. The cover was embossed with the same Ouroboros symbol he had seen earlier, and the pages inside were filled with dense, handwritten text in Latin. He flipped through, catching fragments of phrases. The vessel of eternal hunger, sealed by blood, sustained by fear. The price of opening cannot be undone. He frowned, setting the book aside. He had no idea what these phrases meant, but the tone was unmistakably ominous. The stone pedestal. Unable to resist the pull of the pedestal any longer, Alex approached it cautiously. The box atop it was small, barely the size of a shoebox, and crafted from a dark, lacquered wood. Its inlays of gold and crimson seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. He hesitated, reaching out a trembling hand to touch it. The air around the pedestal felt colder, the shadows in the room seeming to thicken as he drew closer. When his fingers finally brushed the surface of the box, a chill shot up his arm, and he pulled back instinctively, steeling himself. He leaned in to examine the carvings on the box. They matched the symbols on the walls, spirals, jagged lines, and grotesque faces contorted in agony. In the center of the lid, the Ouroboros encircled a small gemstone. It was deep red, almost black, and seemed to glimmer with an internal light. Bloodstone, Alex murmured, his breath fogging in the cold air. The word had appeared in the Latin fragments he'd read earlier, and something about it felt significant, though he didn't yet understand why. The diary. On the pedestal, next to the box, lay a book. Its leather cover was cracked and peeling, but the gold lettering on the spine was still legible. Anno Domini 1477. Alex's pulse quickened as he picked it up. The diary was old, older than anything else in the room. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble under his touch. The handwriting inside was jagged and uneven, as though written in haste or under great duress. It was in Old Romanian, but Alex had studied enough of the language's evolution to understand most of it. The first entry. The first entry was dated January 12, 1477. The blood court gathers tonight. The Count's thirst for power grows insatiable, and he will stop at nothing to claim dominion over life and death. They speak of a stone, the Bloodstone, that can bridge the divide between our world and the next. I fear what they intend to unleash. Alex's brow furrowed. The mention of the Bloodstone sent a jolt of recognition through him. It wasn't just a relic. It was the centerpiece of the rituals Mihai had warned him about. The next entries were equally disturbing. The sacrifices continue. The altar beneath the chapel runs red with their blood. The Count believes this will bring him immortality. But at what cost? The Watcher grows restless. Its presence is felt in every shadow, every breath of cold air. I tried to leave tonight, but the doors would not open. The castle holds us captive now, its stones thrumming with life. We are prisoners of our own ambition. The final entry. Alex flipped toward the end of the diary, the tone of the entries becoming more frantic as the pages progressed. The final entry sent chills through him. It is done. The Bloodstone has claimed its vessel, and the Watcher now walks among us. The Count is gone. No man can survive what I witnessed tonight, but his laughter lingers in the halls. We have sown the seeds of our damnation. To whoever finds this, leave this place. Do not look for answers. The Bloodstone's hunger cannot be sated. Alex sat back, his hands trembling. The words were clear warnings, but they only raised more questions. What had happened to the Count? What was the Watcher? And why was the Bloodstone so dangerous? A growing presence. As Alex set the diary down, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. His breath came in visible puffs, and the flashlight flickered again. He glanced around, the oppressive feeling of being watched returning in full force. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and ripple, moving against the light. For a moment, Alex thought he saw shapes within them, twisted figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. The groaning sound he had heard earlier returned, louder this time, reverberating through the small chamber. He turned back to the pedestal, his eyes drawn once again to the Bloodstone. The gem in the center of the box seemed to glow faintly, its light pulsing in time with the groaning. "Am I disturbing something?" Alex muttered under his breath, taking a step back. Temptation and fear. Despite his fear, he felt an almost magnetic pull toward the box. It was as if the Bloodstone was calling to him, whispering in a voice too faint to hear but impossible to ignore. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the lid. He wanted to open it, to see the artifact described in the diary. Perhaps it would provide the answers he sought. Answers about the rituals, the Watcher, and the castle's curse. But Mihai's warnings echoed in his mind. Some things are better left hidden. Alex hesitated, his hand shaking. He wasn't sure if it was courage or fear that ultimately stopped him. But he pulled back, leaving the box untouched. The door opens. Just as he stepped away, the stone door behind him creaked open, the sound startling in the silence. Alex spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the corridor beyond. "Mihai," he called, his voice shaking. There was no response, but the door remained open, as if inviting him to leave. Alex cast one last glance at the room, the carvings, the artifacts, the diary, and the ominous box on the pedestal. His instincts told him to run, to leave it all behind and never look back. But his curiosity was insatiable. Taking the diary, he slipped it into his bag and stepped back into the corridor, the groaning sound following him as he climbed back toward the chapel. He didn't see the shadows that coalesced around the pedestal as he left, nor the faint, blood-red glow that pulsed from the box as the door swung shut behind him. The awakening. Alex stood at the center of the hidden room, his flashlight casting long, quivering shadows across the walls. The Bloodstone seemed to pulse faintly atop the ornate box, its deep crimson glow rhythmic, like a beating heart. He couldn't help but feel as though the artifact were alive, its presence suffusing the room with a sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The air was colder than ever, each breath forming visible puffs of vapor, despite his better judgment and Mihai's dire warnings. Alex couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something magnetic about the stone, something that beckoned him closer. He leaned in, inspecting the intricate carvings on the box once more. Symbols spiraled outward from the Bloodstone like tendrils, their patterns almost hypnotic. His fingers hovered over the edge of the lid, trembling. "Just a peek," he whispered to himself, a growing tension. As he touched the box, the groaning sound that had been emanating from the walls grew louder, resonating deep in his chest. The room felt smaller, as though the shadows were closing in around him. The Bloodstone's glow intensified, casting an eerie red light that painted the carvings on the walls in vivid, otherworldly hues. For a moment, Alex thought he saw movement in the shadows, quick, darting shapes that vanished when he turned his head. His hand trembled as he pressed against the lid. It resisted at first, but with a faint click, it loosened, and Alex lifted it slowly. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark velvet, was the Bloodstone. It was larger than he had anticipated, roughly the size of a clenched fist. Its surface was polished to an almost mirror-like sheen, but its color was unlike anything Alex had ever seen. It wasn't just red. It seemed to shift, swirling with shades of black and crimson, as though something inside it was alive and moving. He reached out tentatively, his fingertips brushing the surface. The instant he touched it, a sharp, cold pain shot through his hand and up his arm. He gasped, pulling back, but the sensation lingered, leaving his fingers numb. the breathing. The room grew impossibly quiet. Even the groaning sound had ceased, replaced by a stillness so absolute that Alex could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then he heard it, a low, guttural breath, wet and labored, as though something large and inhuman were trying to fill lungs that didn't belong in this world. The sound came from directly behind him. Alex froze, his blood turning to ice. Every instinct screamed at him not to turn around, but the primal need to face whatever danger loomed behind him was overwhelming. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure in the shadows. The beam of light cut through the gloom, landing on the far corner of the room. For a moment, there was nothing but the jagged carvings on the walls and the glint of ancient tools on the shelves. But then the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a ripple, a distortion that made Alex question whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. But then the shadows stretched and shifted, forming a shape that was unmistakably humanoid. It stepped into the light. The figure was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally elongated, with claw-like fingers that scraped against the stone floor. Its skin was pallid and translucent, veins like black spiderwebs coursing beneath the surface. Its face was the most horrifying of all, a grotesque amalgamation of human and inhuman features. Its eyes glowed faintly red, burning with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. The thing let out a low growl, its mouth opening to reveal jagged, uneven teeth. Paralyzed with fear, Alex couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The creature's gaze held him in place, its glowing eyes locking onto his, as though peering into the very core of his being. The bloodstone, still clutched in the box, began to pulse faster, its light synchronizing with the creature's shallow, rasping breaths. "Wow, what are you?" Alex stammered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its claws scraping against the stone with a sound that set Alex's teeth on edge. The air in the room seemed to thicken, growing colder with each passing second. Alex's flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker, as though the light itself were being consumed by the creature's presence. A desperate escape. The spell broke when the creature lunged. Alex stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the swipe of its claws. The flashlight slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly. Shadows danced chaotically across the walls as Alex scrambled to his feet. The bloodstone's glow intensified, casting the room in an eerie red light. The creature snarled, its movements unnaturally fluid as it closed the distance between them. Alex grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the pedestal, the beam landing on the bloodstone. The creature hissed, recoiling slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing in what Alex could only interpret as pain. Acting on instinct, Alex shoved the box's lid closed, cutting off the bloodstone's light. The creature let out a deafening roar, its voice a horrible mixture of rage and agony. The pursuit. Alex didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature's footsteps echoed behind him, heavy and deliberate, each step closing the gap between them. The corridor was a blur as Alex sprinted upward, his flashlight bobbing wildly in his hand. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe and twist as he passed, their grotesque forms coming alive in the bloodstone's lingering light. He reached the stone door that led back to the chapel and shoved it open with all his strength. The door groaned in protest, but it gave way, and Alex stumbled into the chapel, slamming the door shut behind him. The creature's guttural growl reverberated through the heavy stone, but it didn't follow. Back in his chamber, Alex didn't stop running until he reached his chamber, his lungs burning and his legs trembling with exhaustion. He slammed the door shut, sliding the bolt into place before collapsing onto the bed. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and his mind raced with fragmented thoughts. The bloodstone, the diary, the creature. It was all connected. He was sure of it. But what had he awakened? He glanced at his bag, which still held the diary. Part of him wanted to open it again, to search for answers, but the other part was terrified of what he might find. The air in his chamber felt heavier now, as though the castle itself had taken notice of him. Every creak of the floorboards, Every whisper of the wind outside sent shivers down his spine. For the first time since arriving at Bran Castle, Alex realized just how much danger he was in. The bloodstones pulled. As he lay on the bed, his breathing slowing, Alex felt an odd sensation in his hand. He looked down and realized with a start that his palm was glowing faintly red, as though it had absorbed some of the bloodstone's energy. The glow faded after a moment, but the sensation lingered, a strange, pulsing warmth that felt almost alive. Alex sat up, his fear giving way to a growing sense of determination. Whatever the bloodstone was, whatever that creature had been, he had to understand it. Mihai's warnings now seemed almost laughable. He couldn't leave the castle, not now. He needed answers, and he would find them, no matter the cost.
And that's why we're living, fucking hoping for one if you're driving.